Good morning.
Morning.
Now, Ms. McIntosh, we have, is it Mr. Wilson this
Mr.
morning?
Wilson this morning and Mr. Pike this afternoon.
Right. Good morning, Mr. Wilson.
Good morning.
As you understand, you're about to be asked questions by Mr. McIntosh, who's sitting opposite you. But first of all, I understand you're prepared to take the oath.
Yes.
Sitting where you are, can I ask you to raise your right hand and repeat these words after me? I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
and
nothing but the truth.
nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Now, I don't know how long your evidence will be. We've scheduled the morning. We usually take a coffee break at 11:30, but should you want to take a break at any other time, just give me an indication and we'll take a break.
Okay.
No, Ms. McIntosh.
Thank you, my lord. Mr. Wilson, I wonder if you can give us your full name.
It's David Alexander Wilson.
Thank you. And did you produce a written statement in response to questions from the inquiry?
I did, yes.
Are you willing to adopt it as part of your evidence?
Yes, I am.
Thank you. Now, what I'd like to do is start, as it were, at the beginning. When did your work as commissioning manager at Multiplex on the Queen Elizabeth Hospital site, or the new Southern General Hospital site, South Glasgow Hospital site, start?
I started in 2011 with Multiplex. That was in the laboratory building at the Queen Elizabeth site. And then it was around about 2012 where I moved on to the actual hospital build.
And was it always as commissioning manager?
Yes. I had other roles, but it was commissioning manager was my title.
So what were the other roles, just in headline terms?
I was involved in the ICT network system within the hospital itself, from a point of view of liaison between Multiplex and the board's IT consultants.
Anything else?
That was probably it, yeah.
Right. So if we think of the commissioning job, not in the laboratories, but on the main building, your statement on the first page, which is page 46 of the witness statement bundle, describes a number of jobs in commissioning engineering before this one.
Yeah.
So sometimes you call yourself a commissioning engineer, and sometimes yourself a commissioning manager.
Yep.
What's the difference?
Well, a commissioning engineer was someone that actually went on and physically did the commissioning activities. Obviously, commissioning manager is someone that manages those activities.
But you had previously been a commissioning engineer.
Yes.
And within the world of commissioning, as a commissioning engineer, do you specialise in particular types of systems?
Yes. Yep. Yes.
Or what's your specialism originally?
It was in HVAC systems, heat and ventilation and controls.
Right. And so, obviously, you're aware the inquiry's been interested in ventilation systems. Yep. If we think about a standard single room in that hospital, which contained a chill beam, a radiant panel, an extract, how much of those fall within that sort of expertise of yours?
They all would to a certain extent, yeah.
Right, okay. Now, what would you see the role of a commissioning manager in a project like this to be?
So the role of commissioning manager would be to manage the overall commissioning process. And in the case of the hospital, that was mechanical services, electrical services, public health services and controls. And my job would be to work with the subcontractor, which in this case was Mercury Engineering, to produce programmes of how we were going to start at the beginning of the commissioning activities right through to the end and the handover of the building. So a lot of my time was spent in programming and sort of logic and sequence of how the build would, how the commissioning would work.
But what does it mean to commission either a piece of equipment or a system or a hospital? What is the essence of commissioning?
So commissioning in itself is taking a system or a component from its static state, maybe it's just sitting actually physically installed, to actually operating in the design conditions that it was the designer has intended.
And so do you measure the output from the system?
Can do, yes, in some sense.
So if we think about commissioning a light system,
yep.
Simplest, you check the lights work, but do you check the light produces the necessary amount of light?
Yes, the engineer would, yes.
The commissioning engineer?
Yes.
Right. And if we go back to ventilation systems, if you had a air handling unit that was supposed to handle a certain amount of air,
yep.
would the commissioning process measure what that is?
Yes.
And if that air handling unit is attached to a system of ducts, and at the end of those ducts are some chill beams, and they're pushing air into wards, would the commissioning process check how much air was coming out the end?
Yes.
And when you come to a water system, would a commissioning process check that an individual calorifier was working?
Yes.
Would it check that the water system was achieving the temperatures it was required to achieve at various points in the system, particularly the furthest away from calorifiers?
Yeah. Yes.
And in the case of water, would a water commissioning process ever involve carrying out water tests?
The last part of the water commissioning would involve taking samples of the water supply, yes.
And what is the information you're trying to gain from those samples?
You're trying to gain is the water sample clean as it is within the parameters for potable water, essentially, so drinking water.
This is the standard Scottish Government test for wholesomeness.
Yeah.
You
Well,
wouldn't be
well, you
testing.
say Scottish Government test. Do you mean that, Mr. McIntosh?
I think I don't. I think I just mean the wholesomeness test for water supply. Is it the standard water supply?
It's the water supply, and that's over the UK's. It's a general
Yes.
standard, yeah.
I mean, there's the Water Scotland Act, and there's regulations, and there's a standard, I think, for potable water, and that's what you're talking about, I think.
Yes, I'm looking at the that there's health and safety that the Scottish standard under the Water Supply Water Quality Scotland Regulations 2001. Would that be what you're trying to achieve?
We would generally try to achieve what's set usually in the HSE 274, which is the Legionella part of the standards. There's HSE standards generally trying to achieve.
Okay, well, we'll come back to that, but that's useful. So if we move to a ventilation system which has filters in it, would you be checking that the filter system is doing the amount of filtering you would expect it to do?
That depends. The engineer would check to see the filters are clean, and they would check that the filters are installed correctly within the air handling unit. And that's the general standard filters. The real filters you probably test would be HEPA filters.
So
It's
if
a
you
high
had
efficiency filter.
if you had a HEPA filter feeding into a particular ward or room, would you, for example, test the air inside the room to see how clean it is after the filter's been running for a period?
They would not necessarily the air inside the room. They would test, basically, they'd put a dispersed oil in one side of the filter and check how much gets through to the other filter to make sure the seals are correct and the filter's actually filtering out what's required to do.
So you're checking the filter's installed correctly?
Installed and it's working correctly.
Working correctly. Now, we've heard in the context of ventilation evidence about the context of validation. What do you understand to be, in the context of ventilation, the difference between commissioning and validation?
So commissioning is a process from taking it from a static to completion to a dynamic operation within the design parameters. Validation, we would come in after that, someone who hasn't done the commissioning to check the systems to make sure they meet the requirements of the client, essentially.
And one would hope that the requirements of the client and the system's objectives designed by the designer are the same thing.
You would hope so, yes.
Now, before we go back to those topics in some more detail, I want to understand who it is who you're working with and how you got up to speed. So, what steps did you take when you arrived to understand what the designers had designed to be installed?
I would look at essentially drawings, so the designer's drawings and various schedules they had for equipment, etc.
And these are the construction drawings?
These would be design drawings that then Mercury would take to construction status.
Right. And are you aware of the process of user groups and the sign-off of 1 to 50s and room data sheets?
Yes.
Is this after that stage?
That's after that stage,
Right.
yes.
Okay. In order to do your task, would you read any other documents like contract documents, the employer's requirements?
Employers' requirements, not so much contract documents as such, but certainly employers' requirements, you'd look at those.
Right. Are you aware?
Sorry, my fault for really just not hearing you. You would check employers' requirements.
Yes, we'd be looking at employers' requirements on the specific subject I might be looking at in the drawings. So if it's to do with ventilation, I might look at employers' requirements to do with ventilation systems.
To use an example, if you were looking at commissioning an isolation room, you would look at the construction drawings,
Yes,
and you might look at the employer's requirements.
potentially, yes.
What else might you look at to understand that system you're about to commission?
Look at grill schedules. You would look at technical submissions for the plant and equipment that was being.
So this came in
looked
from
at.
the suppliers.
That would be coming from the certainly subcontractor, Mercury, yeah.
Would you look at guidance documents?
You would look at guidance documents in certain instances, yeah.
So in this case, if the isolation rooms refer to SHPN documents or HBN documents, would you read those?
Yeah.
Now, there's a clause in the employment contract between Brookfield Europe and NHS GDC, which I want to put to you to ask you a question. And we've extracted it into a provisional position paper on this matter, which is in bundle 26, document 3 at page 202. And you see 5.6. Now, it's entirely out of context. I appreciate that. So I'm not asking you to interpret the contract, but do you see how 5.6 has a heading, control of infection, and prevention, control of infection shall remain a primary consideration of the contractor in the design and construction of the works? Now, it's not for the inquiry to interpret the contract. The reason I'm putting that up there is simply to ask you, did you, as a commissioning engineer, have any source of advice on infection and prevention and control in your work?
And the work in the hospital?
Yes.
No.
No. Do you have any experience in or training in the aspects of infection prevention control as they relate to the systems you're commissioning?
No.
Now, it may be that other people in Brookfield Multiplex did this, so I'm just asking you, to what extent would you have considered the prevention control of infection in the commissioning process?
To make sure the systems were, as far as I could make sure the systems were commissioned in line with the design, which I would have, expected to be in line with the infection control and the user group outputs.
But you're not checking that, you're just building back to the design. Thank you. Now, if we do that off the screen, or we have already, I'd like to ask about the project team that you're dealing with. If we go to question 6 of your statement, which is on page 50 of the statement bundle, and it's question H. And we asked you, please confirm whether you worked with NHS GDC project team members during the project, if so, whom, and describe your working relationship with them. And you've listed some people. And the first person you mentioned was Mr. Parry.
Yep.
So what was his position when you were doing your commissioning work?
He was the estates, I don't know his exact title, but he was certainly working for the project team. He was from an estates background from the Greater Glasgow and Clyde.
And what task did he carry out that you were involved in?
He was involved with sometimes witnessing some systems. He would go out and look at some systems, or some of his staff would. Got involved with him to do with the assets in the building and the systems within the building. So I had a fairly reasonably good relationship with Ian.
Did you have any involvement with him in carrying out the tests? Would he witness them, for example?
He did in some instances. He would be invited to them. Some instances he wouldn't be able to make it, but he would be invited to them, and he did attend some of them. I'm not entirely sure which ones, but I recall.
Mr. Alistair Smith, what was his role in the GGC project team, as you understood it?
He was, again, someone working within the project team who would, he probably attended most of the witness activities for the Greater Glasgow and Clyde side of the project team.
Do you know what his professional background was?
I don't recall exactly, but I think he was an electrical engineer to trade.
Do you happen to remember when he arrived on site, do you?
Don't recall, to be honest.
And then Karen Connolly, what was she doing in the GGC project team as far as you understood it?
So she was the GGC's commissioning manager, which had a slightly different definition to what our commissioning, as in what we would be doing.
So what did you understand that definition to be?
She was dealing a lot with particularly looking at the migration of the different departments moving into the building, and working with, I think, different departments before they came to the building.
I mean, you say that's a bit different. It's maybe quite a bit different. I mean, just so that I'm following, she's concerned about getting patients and staff into the building, and presumably not concerned with equipment or plant.
No, I think she maybe had something to do with equipment, as in the board's equipment moving
Right.
across, but not to do with mechanical, electrical, public health
Right,
systems. No.
okay. Thank
So
you.
this would be like the board's medical furniture, testing equipment, computers, that sort of thing.
MRIs, CT scans, that
Right.
type of thing. Yeah.
If we look on to Eleanor McColl, what was her role in the GGC project team?
She was in the IT side, so she was someone I dealt to do with the IT and the systems that were going to be put into the
This is the
hospital.
ICNet system.
Yeah, IT network systems, yeah.
Right. Mr. Moyer, what was his role in the GGC team?
He was the project manager for Greater Glasgow and Clyde on the project team.
And so how often do you deal with Mr. Moyer?
Probably not a lot during the actual construction and commissioning of the hospital, probably more at the post handover.
And then over the page we have Mr. Kearney. What did he do in the GGC project team?
He again was an IT engineer that dealt with the IT side, worked with Eleanor.
And then Mr. Loudon, what was his role in the GGC project?
He was the project director when Alan Seaborn left and David Loudon took over as project director for Greater Glasgow and Clyde.
Now, maybe by reference to this list or other people who will now occur to you, if you were thinking about the ventilation systems that you were commissioning, who in the GGC team had the technical experience or knowledge to understand the systems at the level you were operating at?
Probably Ian Powrie, Alistair Smith maybe to a lesser extent.
Would Mr. Moyer have had that experience?
Very, very surface level experience, I think, not technically.
Now, when it comes to the water system and the commissioning process for either components or the whole system, who in that list or anyone else you now remember in the GGC team had a level of experience or knowledge that was comparable to yours in respect to the water system?
I think certainly Ian Powrie would have. And again, Alistair Smith maybe to a lesser extent.
Okay. Are you aware of whether, or did you interact with any mechanical, electrical engineers other than Mr. Smith who were providing advice to GGC's project team whilst you were at the site?
Probably later on towards where we're doing client training. So we're training a lot of the maintenance engineers on the building and the systems in the building.
So
So
these were GGC staff?
These were GGC staff.
But in terms of external consultants, they didn't have an M&E consultant?
They had CAPTA with the NEC supervisors. They had certainly M&E staff working with them, who came and witnessed tests as well. The Wallace Whittle, I believe, as I remember, worked with the staff early doors, but probably weren't as involved during construction and commissioning.
And I need to break that down because that's quite a complicated period of time. So if we look at the period after you arrived on site in 2011, what work were Wallace Whittle doing then?
They were working in a laboratory building at the time as designers. I don't recall what they were doing in the hospital.
And who were they working for?
On the laboratories, I think they were working for us as novated designers.
Right. Now, if we can go to page 49 of the statement bundle, to recognise is going backwards, and question 5E. We've asked you who from the Queen Elizabeth team had infection control input and at what stage. Now, what I'd like to understand is when you arrived in 2011, after that point, did you have contact with any members of the GGC infection prevention control team?
I don't recall anything at that stage, no.
Between arrival and handover, it may have been different after handover, did you interact with a Jackie Stewart or Barman Roy, who was an infection control nurse seconded to the team?
And remember the name Jackie Stewart. I don't remember having much interaction with them at that time. The first I recall getting them or hearing more about the infection controls when we were trying to get the water samples witnessed. And I think that's when Ian Powrie engaged infection control to come out and witness some.
And
of
when
those
is that?
That would be late 2014 or early 2015 when we were doing the test.
So this is you doing water sampling as part of the commissioning process of the water system?
Yep.
Yeah. How did that work? How many samples would you have taken and where were they from?
Well, it was obviously Mercury Engineering were taking the samples with their subcontractor rather than me taking them. But there would be samples taken from various points in the system, what we would refer to a lot of them as sentinel points. So points that are near to the source of the water, points that are furthest away, and a mixture in between. So there would be something in the region, a couple of hundred samples, I would imagine, be taken at any points going through the hospital.
And was a report prepared of those samples?
There was H&V Commissioning, who were the water specialists working for Mercury, and they produced a schedule of the samples that basically said, pass and fail on the sample analysis. And part of that would have been the sample analysis reports from the laboratories as well.
And what were the organisms being detected or not detected or looked for in that sampling?
You'd have E. coli, coliforms, Legionella, and total viable counts, TVCs.
Were you looking at that point for pseudomonas?
No.
And did any part of the systems generate above threshold results for any of those tests?
The ones I recall were probably TVCs, and I don't remember any Legionella or E. coli or coliforms, but I do recall TVCs, and there was a bit of a thing with TVCs where there wasn't particularly a stipulated limit on them at that time. So we were taking a bit of advice from the water specialists, and then obviously looking to the Estates Department as well. But there was certainly higher TVCs in some of the samples than we would have expected, yeah.
Okay. I'm going to come back to the water testing later on. What I'd like to do is to look at the end of that question, E. Do you see you then said, I recall meeting Dr. Peters and Dr. Inkster around June 2015 when reviewing the ventilation design. Why were you reviewing the ventilation design in June 2015?
There was questions coming from Greater Glasgow and Clyde about ventilation rates in various areas of the building. The ones I recall were Ward 4B and Ward 2A. So at that time we were getting queried on ventilation rates and ventilation design.
Would that also have extended to topics such as HEPA filtering and pressure differentials?
Yes.
Is this after handover?
Yes. Yeah.
And would the subject of air change rates have come from and pressure differentials and HEPA filters come from Dr. Peters and Dr. Inkster, or did they come from you?
They inquired into it. I think they started the process of inquiring into it.
Had anybody from GGC, I mean, they may have raised it with other people, but raised with you in the commissioning process the question of air change rates, HEPA filters, and pressure differentials for any part of the hospital during the time you were doing the commissioning process?
Not that I recall. Other than maybe people were witnessing the tests would be looking at that type of thing, or Mercury would be, and people witness. But I don't recall anybody saying there was an issue or a problem or something they thought wasn't right.
At this point, did you know that most of the single rooms in the hospital were being supplied with air at 40 litres a second by design rather than 6 air changes an hour?
I knew there were 40 litres a second, yes.
Right. In these conversations, did you tell Dr. Peters and Dr. Inkster that? Or did they already know?
I honestly don't recall.
Because their evidence is that point they didn't know. And Dr. Inkster's position is that she didn't know until 2016 that there'd been what we've been calling a agreed ventilation derogation. I accept that's not anybody else's name, it's an inquiry. But if you knew that 40 litres a second was the input into the room, why did you not tell Dr. Peters and Dr. Inkster about it when they were inquiring about air change rates?
I would have maybe told them about it. It wasn't something, I hadn't jumped to any sort of conclusion in my head there was any issues at that stage when they were asking about it.
The reason I say that is because they've given quite a lot of evidence and there's quite a lot of documentation of them raising concerns about the ventilation system in the second half of 2015. And at that point, they're not raising air change rates as the problem. They're raising filtration and things. And so I do wonder whether if you'd told them, they probably would have told someone. So could it well be that you didn't tell them about the 40 litres a second at that point?
If I'd have been asked, I would have told them. I don't recall too much about it.
Could that have been found out from the room data sheets?
Yes, I think when I've looked at room data sheets, they certainly say on there about 10 litres per second per person, so they could have found them off of them, yeah.
Were you looking at room data sheets as part of the process for doing commissioning?
No.
No. When did you become aware that this 40 litres a second supply arrangement to single rooms was around about half the air change rate recommended by the Scottish Hospital Technical Memorandum 2003-2009 draft? When did you first become aware of that?
I don't recall when I became first aware of that, but I certainly became more aware of that at the stage when people were starting to ask questions about it, from Ian Powrie or Dr. Inkster or Peters. That's when I became more aware about it, to do more research into what the issues were and were they correct.
Because if we go back to your evidence about what you looked at during the commissioning process, if I recollect it correctly, it's the drawings, maybe the employer's requirements. I think you agreed you might look at guidance in some cases. Before, say, 2015, had you ever read SHTM 0301, the ventilation guidance?
Yeah, I would have looked at various parts of it for various projects I've been working on, maybe before multiplex.
So what's your evidence about whether you knew what the recommended, if that's the right word, air change rate is for a single room in a general ward in that guidance at the time you're doing the commissioning? Did you know that?
I possibly did. I don't recall. We, as part of the commissioning process, you were looking at the design outputs and what the litres per second were, because that's what was measured at the grill face.
And would it matter, we might explore what matter means at this moment, would it matter to the commissioning process that a room was not delivering what is recommended in a guidance document like SHTM 0301?
Not particularly at that stage, because you were, and the engineers were commissioning the systems to the design output essentially on that one.
Could I just check something which I should know? You mentioned, I think, in passing, the an air change rate of 8 litres per second. Now, is my recollection correct or not, that the figure of 8 litres per second is the building regulation per person? Is the building regulation requirement?
I think it's 10 litres a second, 10
Is
litres
it
per
10?
second. Yeah, per person. I think it's building regulations, or
Right.
was at that time.
So if you were designing to, on the assumption that, let's say, 5 people would be in a room at any one time, you multiply either 8 or 10 by 5. Is that right?
Yes.
Right. Thank you.
We've already discussed, in a sense, that in the ventilation system, you're checking that the system works. The air handling unit to the grill does what you're expecting. But can we extend that logic to a room as a whole? So if we're dealing with a isolation room, not an individual room, would you be commissioning the room as a whole?
You'd be commissioning the ventilation systems to the design. There'd be others maybe checking that certain aspects to do with bed position and sink position and numbers of sink would be checking that.
But what I mean about that is that are you familiar with the concept of a positive pressure ventilated lobby isolation room?
Yes.
Yes. So these are the ones that were set out in HBN 04 and SHPN 04 in various versions.
Yeah.
And they come from the Building Research Establishment in England.
Yes.
Yes. Now, I hope not to take you to the document. In fact, I think we might just jump to it because it might speed things up. But if we talk about it in general terms, an isolation room would have an intended pressure gradient, wouldn't it?
Yes.
And yes, if we go to bundle 16, document 4, page 314, do tell me if you've never seen this before, Mr. Wilson. Document 4, page 314. So have you ever come across HBN 4 before?
Yes.
Right. Could I just walk you through that, and we'll just put up a drawing to assist you and me in answering your questions. And so let's start on page 327. So there's a drawing here of an isolation room example layout. What I'd like to understand is the limits of your testing in commissioning. So I'm assuming that you would test the supply air handling unit that's in the middle of that drawing, in the real drawing,
Yep.
to do that it's what it's supposed to do according to the construction drawings.
Yes.
Right. And you'd test the fire plant isolation damper that's just to the right of it.
Yep.
Yep. And you test how much air comes out of the supply in the lobby.
Yes.
Yes. And would you test how much air goes into the extract in the ensuite?
Yes.
Right. Would you test the transfer grill to see that it does transferring?
Yes, that would be a test in there. Yeah.
It would be a test.
Yeah.
Right. Now, one of the things that is, there's also a pressure stabilizer in this drawing above the door between the patient's room and the lobby. Would you test that?
They'd be checking the operate.
Checking the operate. Now, we understand there's obviously going to be a pressure gradient if this is designed and built correctly from the lobby to the ensuite.
Yes.
Would you check that pressure gradient?
No.
No. Why not if you're trying to commission the room?
The key thing with the pressurised lobby was basically checking the lobby pressures to the corridor. So we're checking to make sure you did the equipment the right pressure from the lobby to the corridor. That was one of the purposes of the rooms, to make sure you get air moving towards the room and then out the room to keep any kind of nasties out or nasties in.
So one of the pieces of evidence that we've had is that, I'm just going to find a drawing that enables me to illustrate that, if you just bear with me for a second. In fact, I probably don't need one. Yes, if we go to page 334, there's been some evidence. This happens to be an example of an isolation room with a lobby, a room, and in the top right corner, an ensuite. Now, there's been some evidence that if you vary these designs slightly, they will behave quite often in radically different ways. To the extent if you move the bed into a different position, it can cause problems to the ventilation flow. Is that something you've ever been aware of?
I know various external conditions affect ventilation systems, but not to that level of detail within the rooms.
So, but if I understand, your position is that you don't test the room as a whole, you test the components within the room, and you test that there's a pressure differential between the lobby and the corridor.
Yep.
And if, for example, the design had a partial extract in the bedroom and a partial extract in the ensuite, which is called different from this document, you would simply test those particular extracts to make sure they're extracting the right amount.
The engineer would, yeah.
You wouldn't, again, test the whole pressure flow of the system.
Not to my recollection.
Okay, we can take that off the screen. Thank you very much. Now, can we go to SHTM 0301, which is the 2009 version, bundle 16, document 5, page 342. Now, I'm not going to make you read the whole thing in the hearing, because I think it takes too long, but if we can go to chapter 8.64, which is at page 468. You see 8.64 rather, we see a statement in this guidance: following commissioning and or validation, a full report detailing the findings should be produced. The system will only be acceptable to the client if at the time of validation it is considered fit for purpose and will only require routine maintenance in order to remain so for its projected life. 8.65. The report shall conclude with a clear statement as to whether the ventilation system achieved or did not achieve the required standard. A copy of the report should be lodged with the following groups: the user department, infection control if required, and estates and facilities. Now, I'm going to stick with factual matters. Did NHS-DGC request a commissioning or validation report from you in respect of the ventilation systems of this hospital?
As part of the contract was to provide commissioning reports for all systems. So they would have been passed on via the Zootech system that they were stored on.
Because there's some suggestion that some of these documents weren't there.
Not to my recollection.
Well, did you or someone under your direction upload every single commissioning report for the ventilation system onto that system?
So Mercury Engineering were responsible for uploading the commission reports onto the Zootech system. There would have been checks by myself and some of my colleagues as well on systems to make sure stuff was on Zootech. And we were chasing, that was a constant chase with Mercury to make sure the appropriate reports were being issued.
And are these almost sort of random checks? You're checking some?
Yeah, you try to check the majority were there if you possibly could, but yeah.
Whilst we're on this topic, actually, it raises a question. We had evidence from a number of clinicians that after handover in Ward 2A, HEPA filter units were missing from some of the ventilation systems in the isolation rooms, the bone marrow treatment rooms in that ward in summer 2015. Now, how could it be, if the ventilation system had been commissioned, that there were literally no HEPA filters in the units they were supposed to be in?
There wasn't a requirement within the design for HEPA filters to be installed. There was a requirement for a HEPA filter housing that could at some stage a HEPA filter be installed, but at the time there wasn't in the design, to my recollection, that the HEPA filters had to be installed in isolation rooms.
You did know what that ward was for, didn't you?
I knew it was for cancer patients, yeah.
So I suppose this is the question, and I'm only asking you as a commissioning engineer. I'm sure Multiplex have a corporate position on this, and I'll ask Mr. Ballingle for that tomorrow. Would it not be prudent, in terms of delivering a hospital that is safe to use, to flag to a client that they are actually getting HEPA filters in their housing units? Fear they might have made a mistake in the process of approving the design.
I was aware the guidelines to put the housing in there, and if HEPA filters were requested, put them in. I wasn't necessarily aware at that stage, which I am now, about the definition of neutropenic patient, which I wasn't aware of back then, and that's what a neutropenic patient required within the facilities, which is outlined in SHTM.
Yes, because there is a sort of, I mean, this is putting it slightly unfairly, but it illustrates the point. The Schiehallion unit is a well-known unit.
Yep.
It receives quite a lot of publicity. I'm assuming that by the time you're working on the hospital, you sort of realise this is going to be the Schiehallion unit. Would that have been the case?
Sorry.
It's going to be the Schiehallion unit. It's going to be the Children's Cancer Unit for the whole of Scotland. You knew that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm only picking at you because you're here in front of me. This question could be asked of many other people. When does it become the job of the commissioning engineer or any other part of the constructors consorted team to go, excuse me, client, why am I installing something that isn't as good as it could be? Is there not a sort of semi-professional obligation to flag those sort of issues?
Certainly at the time, I wasn't necessarily, as back to what I said, I wasn't aware what the condition of the patients would be in. I knew there was a design for that unit. I knew it was a Schiehallion unit and it was a cancer unit, but I didn't have that medical, knowledge to know that they needed to have a HEPA filter in that room for that particular patient cohort at that stage.
And that's why you reference back to the construction drawings?
Yeah.
Right. There is evidence that there was a vent in the ward that was effectively blowing air into the room from a external space rather than extracting it from, going the wrong direction. How would such a vent be spotted, not be spotted in the commissioning process? Would you check every single vent?
Yes, it would be. The commissioning engineer, if he was commissioning the system, would measure every single grill in that system.
So this is not a sampling exercise?
Not the commissioning activity is at every single grill.
Now let's turn to the topic of validation. Now, I do appreciate that validation is not a contractual requirement on multiplex in this contract, and so I'm not attempting to suggest that. But you spent a lot of time programming work. Did you allow time in the process for validation to take place?
No.
Why?
The way I saw our contract was we commissioned the systems, and that's what our programs were all about. With Mercury, it was commissioning the systems to a point of handover. If any validation was to take place, I was assuming, rightly or wrongly, that would be post handover, but before patient occupation.
You see, let's imagine a potential scenario. There's the way you did it, and there's an alternative way, which is where you allow some time for validation. So, imagining you've been quite happily processing through your wards, and it gets to November 2014, and Parry rings you up and says, right, I've got 17 validation engineers arriving tomorrow. They've got more clipboards than you can imagine. They've got lots of equipment. They need 7 days per ward. It'll take us until the last day. Isn't there a risk that if that happens, they won't accept the building? And therefore, somebody up the tree in multiplex is going to be saying, Mr. Wilson, we were expecting a handover certificate, and therefore to move on to the next part of our life, to go to another job or whatever it is, get paid. And we haven't got it because they haven't signed the building because they're still validating. Don't you need to allow the validation so that you can move to the next stage in your project and presumably go to a different job eventually?
It wasn't part of our contract, so it was that we had space in our program to commission the systems and have the system witnessed. There would have been space if the NHS wanted to get in validation engineers once we'd finished certain areas. There was space there before the end of the job in some of those systems. But it wasn't something that we were looking at as part of our contractual process.
Because if they'd come to you on the 21st of January and so that's fascinating, thank you for all that, we're now going to validate it, we'll see you next week, that would have been inconvenient to multiplex, wouldn't it?
No, not particularly.
Wouldn't you have had to keep people on the job while they're doing the commissioning, if they don't accept the handover at that point?
We had, well, the point being, I suppose, we had, commissioned the systems. Mercury had commissioned the systems. They had been witnessed by, potentially NHS, Ian or Alistair. They'd been witnessed by Capita as being acceptable. We didn't expect anything to be wrong with the systems at that stage. So if someone had come in to validate, I wouldn't necessarily been expecting them to find 1,000 problems at that stage.
But there were problems, weren't there?
Subsequently, yeah.
So let's just play another hypothetical. If we focus on the things that Dr. Peter and Dr. Inkster were talking to you about in June 2014, let's imagine that GGC had instructed a validation exercise and they'd started doing. Well, when could they have legitimately validated Ward 2A? When were you finished commissioning approximately?
I don't recall. The Children's Hospital was one of the last areas we were commissioning the building, so it might have been September 2014 that came back there. I don't know.
Let's just hypothetically suggest that in October, November, a GGC validation team turns up, no warning. As you say, you find space for them, they start all the work, and they find all the problems.
Yep.
Would that not have been preferable than finding all the problems once the patients were in?
From a hospital point of view, absolutely, yeah.
Would that not have been preferable from Multiplex's point of view as well?
Yeah, but the whole project would have been preferable, yeah.
Because I will ask the question to Mr. Ballingall tomorrow, because obviously he's the big man, but is there not an element of corporate embarrassment that you build a hospital and, in another example, Ward 4B, the adult bone marrow treatment service comes into the building and leaves less than 5 weeks later because it doesn't consider itself to be safe? It doesn't make multiplex look good, but if you'd allowed for validation, maybe it would have been sorted out in advance.
But The design, we commissioned to the design that had been accepted by the user groups and the NHS. We had built to that standard.
And that's ultimately the core of the defence, your position.
But yeah, we had a design, we built to the design, we commissioned to the design.
Now, I'd like to talk about commissioning engineers. Now, you cover that in, well, you're aware there was a requirement in the employer's requirements for there to be a independent commissioning engineer appointed.
Yes.
Yes. And what would be the benefit of an independent commissioning engineer?
It depends on the remit of the independent commission engineer. The independent commission engineer would have sat outside multiplex. They would have, you know, I imagine their remit would have been similar to what my remit was from a point of view of programming. Maybe they would have a more witnessing remit in there. I didn't see huge amounts of benefits with a built in the same remit.
What would an independent commissioning engineer be checking against?
The design.
Always against the design.
Yeah.
Sorry, checking against
The design.
the design.
Would not a commissioning engineer be checking against the employer's requirements?
Potentially, yeah.
Because had there been an independent commissioning engineer, is there any possibility that some of these issues might have been spotted by them? Because an independent commissioning engineer might have had a wider remit than you.
It would depend on the remit. If they had a remit of validation, perhaps, yeah.
Was there any discussion of an independent commissioning engineer being appointed that you're aware of?
Not to my knowledge.
Did you hear anything about whether one was going to turn up?
No.
Can we go to bundle 46, volume 3, document 7, page 725? So this is a PMI 231. Do you see how in this note we have a section from the employer's requirement at the top, 6.81, and we then have a statement, Brookfield have intimated that the commissioning engineer's role will be taken by a BMCE member of staff. Is that Brookfield Multiplex?
Yeah, I'm assuming so, yeah.
That's one of the acronyms of the
Yeah, Brookfield Multiplex, yeah, construction unit.
member of staff, rather than independent commissioning engineer. The board acknowledged the request for a change to the ER's requirements in relation to the independence of the engineer on the basis the current member of staff will have a detailed knowledge of the complexity of installations and are best placed to undertake the role. The scope of the role remains unaltered. Any change to the proposed individual, David Wilson, should be agreed in advance of the board's project manager. So before this PMI was issued, did you know you were being considered for this role?
I knew I was employed by Multiplex as a commissioning manager for the project.
That's not what I asked you. Did you know that you were going to be effectively doing the job of the independent commissioning engineer?
Not till later on, no.
Was there a point sometime after July when someone said, Mr. Wilson, you are doing the job of the independent commissioning engineer under 6.81 of the employer's requirements?
No.
So how could you do the job?
I was employed as the commission manager under remit for Multiplex. That's what I was employed to do.
So when it says Brookfield have intimated that the commissioning engineer role will be undertaken by a member of staff, would that not be one of your colleagues have told GGC that you're going to do this?
Yes.
But you weren't told that you were being given this responsibility?
I was told I was going to be the commissioning manager for Multiplex in the project, and that they were going to an instruction to take out the independent commissioning engineers. I would assume the role of commissioning manager for my one.
Were you ever referred to this section of the employer's requirements and told to do this?
No.
Did people in GGC ever interact with you saying you're the independent commissioning engineer?
Not necessarily. They knew me as the commissioning manager for Multiplex.
So what do you mean by not necessarily?
Well, they knew me as the commissioning manager for Multiplex. That's what I was known as. I wasn't known as the independent commissioning engineer.
Right. But this was a Brookfield decision, according to this document, even if you weren't told about it.
I would have thought it had been a board decision. They issued the PMI.
Okay. Let's turn to page 53 of the statement bundle. question 11. Now, we're going back to the ventilation derogation, bottom of the page. Can we zoom in to the bottom of the page, please? So let's go through these questions again. Describe multiplex's role in respect to the proposal leading the ventilation derogation. Although I was aware of the ventilation derogation during the latter stage of the project, I was not involved in any discussion today, which is true, but it's not really an answer to my question. So what do you understand multiplex's role to have been in respect to the proposals leading to the ventilation derogation? What were you told?
Can you repeat that, sorry?
What were you told about multiplex's role in developing what we call the ventilation derogation?
I don't remember too much discussion about it at the stage where we're commissioning.
Was there any discussion about it?
Not that I recall.
Did anyone tell you how it had come about?
I don't recall, no.
Was there any suggestion that it was connected in some way to temperature of the building?
Not at that. I found that out later on, but not at that stage.
Okay. And then we look at your question 11B. You don't recall when you were aware of the derogation. Let's go over the page to the top of the page. And it's in 2015 when you reviewed the M&E clarification log.
That's when I was starting to be asked the questions about air change rates, and probably Dr. Inkster and Peters at that stage. So therefore I was looking at the logs. I tried to find out where we had that information.
Did you tell them about the M&E clarification log at that time?
I don't recall. I would have told them the information that we had of what we designed to at that stage. Okay. I think most of the information I talked to Dr. Peters and Dr. Inkster was actually through the board, the project team themselves. I didn't have too many meetings with the two of them.
So you were passing information to the board, and they're passing information on to the right. So you're not directly communicating with Peters and Inkster too much.
Not too much, no.
Would you have told your board contacts about your knowledge about the M&E clarification log at that stage?
I don't recall, but I would expect so. That was where I was looking to get the information to tell them about the air change rates.
And in C, is this understanding you describe here, that you understood the derogation changed the air change rate from the guidelines set out in SHTM 301, is that an awareness you acquired in June 2015?
Yes.
Right. Let's move on to D. You refer in your answer, the question is, when you became the derogation, what impact, if any, did you understand the derogation to be? And you said you understood the derogation to change the ventilation design and air change rate in the bedrooms. And then you give the answer, no impact on the commissioning process, which we've already discussed. Which bedrooms?
The single bedrooms.
Because there's a couple of different hypotheses based on, now I think they're all based on the contract, but I'm not going to get you to go into what the contract says. But it's more to understand what people might have told you and you might have worked out at the time. So one school of thought is it only applies to the bedrooms, single bedrooms in the tower. The other school of thought is it applies to all the single bedrooms in the hospital. When you're doing that research, what did you think it was?
I assumed it was the single bedrooms in the hospital.
And not just the tower?
Not just the tower, no.
Okay. But again, this is in June 2015.
Yeah.
After you've done the commissioning. Right. How did you reach your understanding in E that you understood part of the decision to derogate was to reduce operational energy costs and carbon emissions? Does that simply come from reading the M&E log itself?
Yes.
Right. Would it surprise you to learn that the position of many of the GGC project team is they had no knowledge of the M&E clarification log?
It would certainly, the project team was surprised that they didn't know about it, yeah.
Because it's generally the position of many of them that they didn't know it had been agreed in this form.
Seems strange.
But you didn't know it at the time you were doing the commissioning yourself?
No.
No. So I can't ask you if you said something and they looked surprised because you wouldn't have known to say anything. Right. Let's move on to the Ward 2A isolation rooms. So we take that off the screen, please. Now, we've discussed already that the Ward 2 isolation rooms had no HEPA filters in them when they open. And you've explained to me that's because the design, as you understood it, just allowed for the housing, not for the filters. There were a couple of other issues that seem to have arisen at the time, according to the medical staff. The rooms were not sealed as they should be, particularly around light fittings, and there was an absence of pressure monitoring, and there was no double door airlock to the wards. Now, some of those, the airlock to the wards, I presume that wasn't on the design.
I'm assuming so.
Yeah.
If it
But
was,
how would you check that a room is properly sealed?
air permeability test.
And do you do that as part of commissioning?
We didn't know.
Why not?
The air permeability at that time, from my personal view, thought that that was other members of the team in the fabric side of the building as opposed to the building services, which I was dealing with.
The reason I ask that is, could we go and look at a room data sheet? Now, I get the impression that you weren't looking at room data sheets as part of your process,
No.
but it might still help us focus the question. So if we can go to a room data sheet, which is in bundle 47, volume 3, document 8 at page 45. Yes. So this appears to be a room data sheet. It's an early version. I think there are later ones. For a single bedroom, children and young people with relatives overnight stay, it's room NC802 SCH10. And this is the environmental page. And do you see how all there is in the ventilation section is a reference to HBN 0401 supplement 1?
Yep.
But there is negative pressure to corridor. Can you help us whether the drawings for such rooms would have contained pressure differentials indications on them?
I don't think the drawings did. The drawings would have had flow rates on them, air flow rates from the grills, the lobby, the ensuite, and the room themselves.
So, am I right in therefore thinking that your commissioning process for isolation rooms wouldn't have checked whether they were fully sealed?
At that stage, no.
Why do you say at that stage?
Because at that stage we hadn't checked.
It's after handover that you checked.
It was when we brought it attention, we weren't sealed, that we saw there had been a failure between the systems. We had to go and retest them.
Right, and so they should have been checked by somebody else, but they weren't.
Yeah.
Right. If we think for a moment about pressure monitoring, am I right in thinking that you're only going to look for a pressure gauge at the entrance to a room if the drawing has a pressure gauge at the entrance to the room?
Yes, which
Yeah.
it did have.
And we'll take that off the screen. So if we go to bundle 12, document 94, page 781, which is an email 781. Yes. So it's an email, the bottom of the page, from Mr. McKechnie at Wallace Whittle to you. And it says, as per Telecom this morning, we have now had a look through the drawings and Ian Parry's note. As far as I can see, Mark's original response still stands. I cannot explain how the ensuite could go into a negative pressure situation in relation to the isolation room when the door was opened. Looking at the system's drawings, I would have expected the opposite, as the air in the ensuite would have had either a path of the door or open, and if anything, the extract from it would increase. Let me know if you can assist in this further. Now, does this arise after Mr. Loudon writes to Multiplex to complain about this issue?
I think so, yes.
And then you go back to him. Why are you going back in the way you've gone? What's going on here in your reply? I want to understand why you've replied this way.
I was trying to focus the question coming back from the board at that time, as Mr. Loudon's correspondence was to do with the compliance of the room. And that's what I was wanting to focus on with, was it compliant, was it not compliant? And that's the information I wanted out of Wallswell.
So let me just open a document so I can just check something. Yeah, can we go to the previous page? So we have Mr. Loudon's letter. And this is a year or more after handover. Yeah.
Yep.
This is at the point when you've had your conversations with Inkster and Peters.
Yep.
And you know the patient group in this ward.
Yes.
You also know that HEPA filters are actually needed, although this isn't about HEPA filters. Yeah?
Can't remember when we were asked to put in HEPA filters. I can't remember the dates on that.
Well, we're told it's almost immediately in the summer of 15. They noticed there's no HEPA filters. They're sourced from Northern Ireland, I think is Dr. Armstrong's evidence. And they put them in. They tried to go ahead with pediatric bone marrow transplants. So this is the following year. And I do understand that prior to that moment in the summer of 2015, when you're talking to Peters and Inkster and others about the rooms, that you might well have simply been working off the drawings. But at this point, you and the company know the patient group and the concerns. Is that fair?
I'm not sure how much detail we knew, but we knew that it was the cancer patients in the ward. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So the question that we get from Mr. Loudon is, I'm writing to advise you that colleagues from the Boards of Infection Control and the States Department have raised concerns in their opinion. The design of the extract ventilation within the isolation rooms is not compliant with SHPN 04 Supplement 1, which is the sort of Scottish version of the document we just looked at. Yeah? Oh, by the way, Mr. Wilson, someone's trying to create a transcript, so just nodding is going to make their life much worse. Please answer yes or no. And then we have a discussion mentioned to a email from Brookfield Mothbex the previous year, July, confirming that TUV Sud Limited understand the solution provided the isolation is compliant with the guidance, and a copy is enclosed. And then there's a report from the Estates Department suggesting that they're non-compliant, and you want to give the opinions of both parties, and you want to understand your position. Now, let's look at your reply to Mr. McKechnie on the next page. So, the next page, Mr. McKechnie has given an answer, and your reply is you want him to remove detail.
Yep.
Now, I will understand that there might well be a commercial reason to do with a possible dispute that at this point is incipient and hasn't yet crystallized between Brookfield and the Health Board. And I do understand that. But it looks as if you are effectively suggesting that the reply to Mr. Loudon should not contain helpful information about isolation rooms which are accommodating children, extremely sick, immunocompromised children, at that moment in time who are in the wards. Why are you trying to restrict the message in your reply?
I wasn't trying to restrict the message at that time. I was trying to focus the message on the compliance issue. That was the question that we have been asked, and there was a lot of different people at that time asking questions, whether that was through the estates team or David Loudon or staff. But we're trying to focus on the point, from that I wanted was to focus on: is the room compliant or is it not compliant?
Because there is some suggestion. Let me just see if I can show you a drawing that will illustrate this. There is some suggestion that these rooms are erroneously designed because of where the extracts are. And you allow me a moment just to make sure I've got something that might enable me to give you a fairer opportunity to answer this question. Might take a moment. It's a very large bundle. Well, while it's uploading on my system, take a look right screen. You're aware with the idea that some of these isolation rooms have an extract in the room and in the ensuite, yes?
Yes.
Yes. And you're aware there's a suggestion that design is not consistent with HPN 04 and HBN 04 and SHPN 04. You're aware that's an argument?
Yes.
Yes. And that effectively is what Mr. Loudon is saying.
Yep.
Yeah. Now, Mr. McKechnie's response is a sort of detailed, I don't understand. Do you see that?
As in, he didn't understand?
He doesn't understand why it's happened the way it's happened.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he may well be the designer, or
Even-
at least he's coming afterwards and he's looking at it.
Yeah.
We'll find out from him. But do you understand why I'm concerned that not giving the full answer to Mr. Loudon makes it harder for GGC to assess the risk to the patient?
I think that from my point of view, it was back to, again, what I said, it was compliance. Were we compliant, were we not compliant? The bit to do with what Ian Powery and this ensuite negative was something Ian Powery had done. We didn't really have the evidence, I don't think, at that stage. Ian, I'm assuming, was communicating that information with the users and infection control.
So you won't accept that there's something unhelpful about simply saying your answer would have been, I'm assuming, it's compliant, and not explain why you think it's compliant or why you think they're wrong. You're just providing a simple answer, effectively.
At that stage, that's what we're trying to do, yeah.
And you wouldn't accept that that's actually actively unhelpful in terms of making sure that the individual patients are in the right room, properly protected.
That wasn't the kind of question.
Well, let's go back to look at his email. His letter, the previous page. So isn't that inherent in the first question? He's saying the rooms are not compliant with the guidance. I mean, and you are familiar with what the guidance says,
Yeah.
and that it says these rooms aren't suitable for immunocompromised patients. You're aware of that?
That's what he says, yeah.
Yes. So it's quite a serious allegation that's being made. I accept that it might well be the board's fault at some point down the track, but in terms of fixing it, are you being less than helpful?
I wasn't trying to be, no.
Okay, right.
Sorry, you weren't trying to.
I wasn't trying not to be helpful.
Right.
Now let's go on to Ward 4B. So take that off the screen, please. If we go to page 60 of your statement, and we'll go to 31H. The ultimate point I'm trying to get to is the discussion of suspended ceilings, but allow me to take a moment to get there.
Okay.
So if we go to page 60 of the bundle and we look at your answer to what I think is 31H, and we've asked you about the changes to the design, and you've explained, I was aware of changes to Ward 4B during the build stage, it was not involved in the change process, and of course you're involved in the later work. We'll come back to that. And then in the next question, we ask you about carbon filters. And you said you were not involved in the process, but aware there'd been an agreement not to include them in the design. If we go back and think about the change to 4B, from your point of view, are you simply implementing a different set of drawings here? There would have been a construction drawings for 4B as in its final version.
Yes, there was construction drawings, that's what it was built to, yeah.
And you wouldn't go and make your own checks against guidance and that sort of stuff?
No, not personally, no.
No. And the commissioning engineer wouldn't do that?
They would commission to the design, it was there.
And again, the same principles would apply. You would check the air handling units and the grills all did the right thing, but you wouldn't check airflows and you wouldn't check sealing of rooms themselves.
Not in this case, no. There was a different type of ward. There wasn't an isolation room as such, these areas. They were more of a general type of room. So there was no lobby on them. It was just a single bedroom plus an ensuite.
Yes, because I think the point that would have been made in those 5 weeks before those patients left and were sent back to the beats is that these were, in a sense, a sort of isolation room. That's what they're supposed to be.
That's what they were looking for, is my understanding.
Yeah. But you wouldn't have checked the ceiling of the room and therefore whether the room is sealed.
No.
Because you just built the ceiling that was there.
Built to the drawings that were there, yeah.
What would you need to have to be told as a commissioning engineer, not a validation engineer, in order to have actually spotted the ceiling was the wrong ceiling?
It'd be probably told the specification of the room if it was to be an isolation type room.
So you'd have to be told this room is for a particular group of patients, and you have to have a pressure differential.
Yeah, again, telling us what it would be specific. Again, tell me what the group of patients were. Wouldn't necessarily in my head tell us what the design.
No, you'd need to know that it was a sealed room, wouldn't you?
Yes.
Yeah, and if you were told this room is to be a sealed room, and you see a suspended ceiling like this one, you would think, that's the thing that would trigger it, knowing it had to be sealed, not this is the group of patients.
Potentially, my role again was in the building services side of things, so I wasn't particularly looking at, you know, the lay-in grid ceilings or these types of things. We would be putting the output towards that. We wouldn't be looking at the ceiling myself.
So again, is there in some way a difficulty here with the commissioner in that? And
Mr. McIndoe, sorry to interrupt. It's really a sort of, I need a bit of mechanical education. Your question, I think, assumes that a suspended ceiling.
Again, I've done this before. The Lord, you've pulled me up about this before.
I have fallen into this, or at least I think I've fallen into this error before.
And so have I. Can I re-ask my question? So I don't mean a suspended, I mean a sealed ceiling.
Yeah.
So to re-ask that question, do I understand your evidence to be this? Given the information you were told, you didn't know that it had to be a sealed ceiling, and the drawing had a non-sealed ceiling.
Yes.
If you'd been told this is for adult bone marrow transplant patients, that wouldn't have helped you realize there was a problem.
Yes.
You would have needed something more specific, like this room should be sealed and have a pressure differential of X, and then you would have gone, well, I can't do that. It's a non-sealed ceiling.
Yes.
Right. Am I being unfair to spot a problem in the commissioning process, which is that if it's the case that wall treatments, ceiling treatments are a matter for a different process in construction, the actual reality is that you never actually commission a room, you commission the systems that serve the room.
Yes.
And has practice changed in the industry? Do people now commission whole rooms?
The only hospital I've had experience is really after the Glasgow was Edinburgh, and we took I came in at the tail end of that project, and we took a slightly different approach and looked at it more on a whole room basis.
Yes, I mean, again, you would need the information.
Yeah.
But to go back to the Schiehallion unit in Ward 2A, being told to commission the whole room means you might have spotted the non-seals around the light fittings.
Yes.
But being told to commission the whole room in 4B wouldn't have worked because you still didn't know it had to be a sealed room.
Yeah, exactly.
And therefore you're reliant to a great extent of what's on the construction drawings.
Yes.
And any thought that you as a commissioner is looking at the room data sheets is wrong. You're not looking at that.
No.
You wouldn't have to know whether Mercury and the people drawing the construction drawings, would they look at the room data sheets?
I'm not entirely sure. Mercury would be more looking at the consultant, you know, ZBP in this instance is design, and taking them forward to how they're actually going to physically build it, as opposed to looking at room data sheets. I don't necessarily know.
So you think there's the room data sheets come earlier?
Yeah, they come right at the start.
Then there's design drawings.
Yep.
Then there's the work that Mercury do to create construction drawings.
Yes.
Which might be a merger between the architect's drawings and ZBP's drawings.
Yes.
And then there's a construction drawing, and that's what you check.
That's the construction drawing, is what it's built to.
Yeah. And one of the things we've noticed, and I think we saw that when we were looking at the isolation room data sheet, is they mentioned SHPN04. Would the construction drawings for those isolation rooms in 2A have mentioned SHPN04?
I'm not sure if the construction drawings would know.
Would that help to do your job better because you know what sort of room it was?
Not necessarily.
Because if we just think about the problem we've just discussed with Mr. Loud and Mr. McKechnie's letter, and I was asking you some questions. Step back a stage here. If you'd known as a commissioning engineer that that was going to be an SHBN 0401 room, SHPN, sorry, 0401 room, would that have changed the way you commissioned it?
Bear in mind, I didn't actually commission it. I was managing the process, but probably not. The SHPNs, a lot of these guidance documents, there's various grey areas, and that's probably the bits where, you know, people get caught out on.
And that's more what validation's for.
That's more what validation's for, yeah. And even then, validation, it'll be the interpretation of the document at that point in time.
Now, if we go back to the statement page we were on before, but this time we'll go to 35M, which is on page 63. We're going forward in time to 2015, when you are effectively doing more work.
Yeah.
Now, can you tell us how this additional work in 4B came about from your point of view?
My recollection, it was to do with the infection control, or the 4B, sorry, with the unit, the BMT unit from Beatson's coming in, and then looking and not having what they had at the Beatson, where they had various pressure gauges, sealed rooms, all that kind of stuff. So they were looking at the rooms, and they didn't feel they complied with what they wanted.
So they left.
Yep.
And how did it come to be the case that you did more work?
We were instructed to do more work.
Right. And who gave you those instructions?
The instruction would have come from the project team.
Do you remember who on the board side you were dealing with?
Probably Peter Moyer, David Loudon to a certain extent, Peter Moyer, and again Ian Powry.
Did you, in that early process of those new work, that's until December, deal with any infection control doctors or microbiologists?
At what period?
So you get told to do this. What time of year was that?
That was, I think it kind of started probably in March or April, and it was sort of June where we really started to get into the specifications of what was now required.
Yeah. So we have evidence of the room that HI scribe not being signed off in December by Dr. Inkster. And then HFS and HPS get involved, and there's an S-bar. But in the period between, say, June and December, when you're actually doing the work, were you dealing with any infection control doctors or microbiologists in the GDC side?
They were involved, but I wasn't really dealing with them in a great deal.
Who might they have been?
I think it was Dr. Therese Inkster.
Because her evidence is that she didn't deal with you. It was Professor Williams who would have dealt with you.
I don't recall. I do recall Dr. Therese Inkster. I can't remember when I recall, but she was one of the names I always remember, infection control.
Could it be that she's the one who turned around and said that your works weren't good enough in December?
Potentially, yeah.
Okay. How did you feel when, so let's set this up. You do the work in 4B, and I appreciate you going off the drawings, and you discover that the patients have been and gone. How did that make you and your team feel?
A bit bemused, I suppose, that the patients came in there in the first place and then, left.
And then you're asked to do some more work. And you actually do physical work.
Yes.
And Dr. Inkster's evidence is that by the time she's involved, the hospital project actually got the keys off you, as it were. The patients are ready to go back in. And she then doesn't sign off the HI scribe. It's all very last minute. Is that what you remember or something different?
I can't recall too much. I just remember the point being where the patients came in, moved out, and then we were involved in a redesign of the ward.
But then it wasn't accepted.
We through a specification of what we were going to do with the client, they looked at it, we built it, commissioned it, handed it over in, I think, the October of 2015.
But they didn't put the patients back in, did they?
I don't think so, no.
Patients didn't get back in until 2018.
Okay.
Yeah. How did the fact that they didn't use the ward you just upgraded again, how did that make you feel? What do you think then?
I thought there'd been a lot of money wasted in doing an upgrade that wasn't accepted.
Could the reason that the upgrade wasn't accepted is it wasn't good enough for the patient group?
For the patient group, potentially. But it was what we did was what was agreed with the project team that they wanted done within the confines of what the rooms that were there, the air handling and the equipment was there.
And apart from, I recognise you don't quite know when you spoke to Dr. Inkster, apart from any interactions you had with Dr. Inkster, do you have any recollection of dealing with anybody on the board side who had the same level of understanding of ventilation systems as you?
The only person I could think of was probably Ian Powry.
Right. I wonder this might be a good point to breaking rule, I was going to turn to the topic of planned preventive maintenance, but I suspect you probably need a cup of coffee before doing that.
As I said, Mr. Wilson, we take a coffee break and we'll do that now. Could I ask you to be back for about 20 to 12?
Yeah.
And I hope you get a cup of coffee.
Thank you.
Right. Ms McIntosh?
Thank you, my lord. Mr. Wilson, during the break, one of my colleagues suggested I might put something to you, and you were given a copy of the document, which is the Innovative Design Solutions Report, which was produced into Ward 2A, and it's Bundle 6, Document 34. And it's at page 676. Now, did you see this report ever before?
I've seen it in the bundles. I don't recall seeing it before that.
Okay, well, I'll take you through it slowly, but it's more because when we were discussing Ward 2A and you were mentioning that there were no HEPA filters in the frames and that was part of the design, it occurred to me that I could ask you a question. And I'll explain why I think I can ask you to. I won't tell me if I'm wrong. So you're an engineer by profession.
Yes.
Yes. And you received the drawings for 2A to commission them. And obviously you're focusing on the equipment, not the walls. But to what extent are you able to look at a design and think, well, I can sort of understand what the designer's trying to achieve here? Do you say that's something you can do?
Yeah, depending on drawing, you can do.
And so if we look at the first, this is Mr. Lambert. Now, Mr. Lambert was instructed in 2018 by NHGC to review the ventilation of wards 2A and 2B, produced 2 reports, get evidence of this inquiry last year, and I think it's fair to say he was relatively critical of the design that you commissioned. And you see the first sentence of the executive summary. Following analysis of the current ventilation strategy within the upper areas of Ward 2A, we anticipate the original accommodation design philosophy was not intended for use by patients with immune response impairment deficiency. On the contrary, the existing ventilation strategy would appear only likely to promote the risks associated with uncontrolled ingress of infection aerosols into patient areas. Now, the only bit I'm going to ask you about is looking at that design, remembering the design that you looked at and then commissioned. Do you think that design philosophy behind that design was intended for use by patients with immune response impairment or deficiency?
Well, again, I'd state that I didn't commission the systems. Looking at the drawings, I probably didn't look at every single drawing either in the job. But if you knew the patient type, as I do know it now, you would have looked in a different way, yeah.
So do you think that there's and I keep this very vague, that it's some measure of an inconsistency between the patient type that you now know and the design that you were looking at?
Yeah.
Right. At the end of this report, that page, at the bottom of the first page, there's a particular detail which you might or might not recollect. And this is of particular note. It was identified that extract ductwork distribution derived from Ward 2A air handling unit is utilised to serve numerous dirty spaces, e.g. toilets, shower rooms, dirty utility rooms, disposal rooms, cleaner stores on various floor levels. This is deemed to be a very abnormal strategy and differs from design methodology adopted within other areas and should be investigated further. Now, the question really is, at the time you were commissioning these air handling units, did you notice that the dirty air from these two rather, was
I don't recall noticing, no. And maybe I didn't witness that system as such, so, but I don't recall it.
okay, we can take that off the screen. I'd like to move to the topic of planned preventative maintenance. And you cover, it's covered actually in a bundle 16, document 23, which is an extract from the M&E clarification log, and I want to look at page 1670. Now, do you see the 4th row on that is ppm?
Yep.
Would you have looked at the M&E clarification log in order to determine what is to be done in terms of commissioning and handover and all the areas within your responsibility?
Not necessarily. Maybe others would have told me that type of thing, but not necessarily looked at this, no.
Because what did your role as commissioning engineer involve putting data into the Zutec system that involved setting out the commissioning result? Was that something done by Mercury?
I didn't necessarily put anything in the Zutec system. That was done by Mercury for the mechanical electrical systems.
But would that have been part of your programming exercise?
No, the programming was to do with the sequence of how the commissioning was getting done. It wasn't necessarily to do with the PPM as such. That was part of the whole operation and maintenance manual in
But-
Vutex.
I'm intrigued to know what the answer is. Does the result of the commissioning exercise for a piece of a particular equipment feed into the PPM process for that piece of equipment?
No,
It's totally separate.
it's separate.
So you would have no role in ensuring that the PPM system contained what it needed to contain.
I had a role to basically make sure Mercury were putting information into the O&M manuals. That was part of my role, just to try and get them to get the information into it.
Right. And so surely in order to do that, you'd need to know what was in the contract.
I knew we had to provide a PPM. Yeah, I knew that that was discussion with other colleagues, but I knew we had to deliver a PPM system.
Good. And I want you to tell me if you think I've got this wrong, but is it a fair criticism that if you put possibly important clauses, terms of a contract into an M&E clarification log, and of course the biggest one is the ventilation air change, but there are others, this might be one of them, they make it hard for people who are actually doing the job like you to find?
It can do it. Maybe output in other spaces. Without looking at this, I can't remember how I knew we had to provide a PPM.
But there's a difference between we have to provide a PPM and what a PPM will contain. Do you understand that?
The PPM generally contains, in any building that you've got certain systems and assets within that building that need maintained. And the PPM generally generated by what equipment you've got. The manufacturer will provide information. So it's not necessarily something that you look at a contract for.
So if we just take that off the screen, I suppose the way to put it is this, is you might think, that is you, people on the multiplex side, and subcontractors, and them, GDC, we have to get a PPM system. And that would be an obvious statement for any building, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. But equally, you might think there's a standard, there's a list of things that need to be there and what it's going to cover and the scope of that PPM system. And that would be helpful information. That's detail, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So would you, on the multiplex side, and your Mercury colleagues, be easily able to access what had actually been agreed without reading things like the M&E log?
I don't recall. There might have been certain aspects of PPM in the ZBP specifications, detail for in there.
But what I'm suggesting to you is that as a user of this contract, not an interpreter of it, but as a user of it, in that you're one of the people, and there's a big team, responsible for producing output, the fact that these provisions are in an M&E clarification log, doesn't that make it harder to find them and to know to deliver them?
Potentially, yeah.
I'd like to move on to the topic of horn taps, which appears on page 68 of the statement bundle, question 43F. But it starts at 43 on page 68. And you're explaining that you weren't involved in the horn taps issue.
Yeah.
Yeah. But if we go on to the next page, there's a timing issue. I want to see if I can take some information from you. We seem to have some evidence of two moments when horn taps are in discussion. One of them is in 2014, when there is a meeting in June 2014, and decision to keep using them. And you explain in your answer to 43D at the top of that page that you didn't attend any such meetings.
I don't recall attending.
Yeah.
No.
And you aren't on the minute, so I'm not expecting you to have been there. And then there's an earlier process in 2012 when there are discussions in the GDC side of the project team about whether horn taps are a good idea. And they go off and they speak to the Vale of Leven Hospital, they speak to NHS Lanarkshire, and they go and investigate. Were you aware of any moments when the question of whether to use horn taps was ever in debate?
I remember a lot going on in the background with various meetings that others attended, that there was a big debate about where they're going to use them, were they not going to use them. So I knew there was a lot going on in the
Well,
background.
was that debate in 12 or 14?
I don't recall. It might have been in 2014 at that stage, but I don't recall.
And by that point, they'd been bought.
Yeah, well, it was before they were bought, because there was certainly a time I remember discussions before there was an order placed.
So right, that's what I'm just clarifying. So you'd be comfortable with going as far as saying that before they were ordered, there were discussions, but you weren't involved in it.
Yes.
Now, how do you commission a tap with a TMV in it? What's the process?
Essentially, the process, there's a document set out what you do. You essentially take tap temperatures. You prove you're getting the correct temperature out the tap, whether that's 43 degrees. Once that you've established that tap is giving you the right temperature in the hot mode, you do what's called a cold water failure test. So you essentially turn the cold water off to the tap to ensure that someone can't get scalded if there's no cold water to reduce the temperature down, so the tap switches off.
Do you test the ability to carry out maintenance, so to remove the TMV and that sort?
No, not necessarily, no.
So if the testing would have been done, what, 2014?
2014 would have been the test, and it would have started, I can't remember, there was an area of the building that would have started first before it moved towards the end. Yeah, 2014.
I think I know where this is going, but I think I should cover it. Is there any role in commissioning for thinking about how the tap should be used in the future? In this case, there seems to be a suggestion that these taps required a level of thermal maintenance, of cleansing every so often. Would that be something you'd have got involved in as commissioning engineer?
I knew there was discussions on that, but not something I particularly got involved in. But there was various discussions about the ease of removing the taps, so that the NHS, as part of their general maintenance, could take the tap off, disinfect it, put it back on, or put a replacement tap on when the other tap went away, get disinfected, thermally disinfected. So I knew there were conversations about that.
Do you know who in the DGT project team was talking about these issues?
Again, I don't recall.
I want to move on to the filling of the water system. Now, we're keen to obtain as much clarity as possible, and you're just the first of a number of witnesses who get asked these questions about when and how the water system was filled. Now, the evidence from Mr. Parry in the last block of the hearing was that the filling took place possibly in 13 or 14, and he's not particularly clear. And in your questionnaire, we asked you about this, actually, the bottom of this page 4, question 44. And you said, I was aware the systems were filled before January 15. Well, we were too. That wasn't the question. We need to be more precise. The systems were filled by Mercury Engineering, and the system had to be filled prior to January, as you wouldn't be able to complete the testing, commissioning, and disinfection sampling of the water systems before handover. Although I can't remember exactly when the systems were filled, they were filled in phases. The process would have been ongoing throughout 2014. Mercury's process was the system was initially tested with air to ensure there were no open ends, prior to being filled with water for hydraulic pressure tests until the pipes were sound with no leaks. Before ceilings and finishes were installed, I had no concerns when the systems were filled. My understanding was that Mercury and H&V commissioning would manage the water in the systems after the filling, before testing, before flushing, commissioning, disinfection, sampling, and post-disinfection draw-off. It is usual practice to fill the water system. Now, let's see if we can get some dates out of that. Do you need the water system to be filled to test the taps?
Yes.
Right. And you do the air test first?
The air test is, first, just to prove there's no open ends in the pipework.
So can we assume that there's on the day of the testing of the first tap, that bit of the system would have been air tested some days or weeks before?
Yeah.
Right. Can you help us when the first horn taps, or any taps and showers, were being tested?
That would have been 2014 at some stage. The first areas were under what we call Plant Room 21, which did the critical care and accident emergency. So that was the first day of the building that was we tested, I would imagine. So it was
Right.
20.
Plant room 21, right? Well, we know where that is. That's helpful. And that what time of year in 2014?
I'll pass. I think maybe summer. I don't know. Can't recall.
Why do you think summer?
Because that, in the scale of when to get to 2015 and handover, it would need to be somewhere along that line to progress the building, get everything
Right.
commissioned.
So you think you needed effectively 6 months to do this job?
To do the various jobs and the jobs that followed it, yeah.
So let's look back at your answer on this page, actually. So we mentioned the hydraulic test first at the top of the page. So the ceilings had to go in before the hydraulic pressure test. Or they go in afterwards.
The ceilings would go in generally afterwards.
Yeah, and these are the suspended ceilings of various types.
Yeah.
So when were the first ceilings being hung in the hospital?
Pass. Don't know.
And then you've obviously mentioned your reassurance about mercury and H&V in your answer. But then you listed a series of things that would then happen in the fifth line. After the filling and testing, before flushing, commissioning, disinfection, sampling, and post-disinfection draw-off. Let's try and understand what all those things are. So we'll start with the filling. Is that the filling you need to do after the hydraulic test?
No, the filling is done after the pneumatic test to enable your hydraulic test.
Okay. And then the testing is the actual testing of the taps, the showers, the hydraulic systems.
Yeah.
What else do you test at this point?
The testing of the taps and all that comes after the filling. So any tap temperatures, we do the thermal balance of the system as well.
And you'll test the calorifiers and you test the
all that.
All the valves. Now, I'm going to show you a drawing that appears in Mr. Walker's report, but I think he would have got it from of course, I've moved it to a different page. It's bundle 21, document 5, page 213. So this is a drawing that Dr. Walker includes in his report, but my recollection is that with some annotations come from him, but the original document has come out of some form of design system. So we can look at page 213 of bundle 21, please. Now, it's top of the page, if we could zoom right in. So I think that's the red emergency bypasses are added by Dr. Walker. But just from your point of view, can we just zoom out a little bit so we get the bottom of that? Right, thank you. When you're talking about filling in order to do the hydraulic tests, we're talking about the hot and cold domestic system here.
Yes.
Yes. How much of this system, and I recognize this is a very schematic diagram, has to be filled for you to do hydraulic tests of this sort on part of the hospital?
Essentially, you're starting from the bottom of that, the water tanks, and working up. So certain water tanks be filled to allow you to get the boosters to fill the system.
Right.
Boosted pumps.
Would you need to fill the filtration plant, the filtered water tanks at this stage in order to do it?
Not necessarily, no.
No, you just use raw water.
Raw water, Scottish water, raw.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
So the booster pumps would be in use.
Yeah.
And then the various plant rooms. Plant room 21, you're saying, would have been the first one to be done.
So, yeah.
Right. Would you do it in a 4-part division like on that drawing? So plant room 21 and then 22 and 41 and then 32 and 33 and then 31 or in those 4 groups?
Pretty much, because probably when plant room 21 was getting tested, the other areas of the building weren't ready to put water into them.
But are we right to think that the water system is logically divided into those 4 parts?
That's how it was worked. That's how it was designed.
So in order to do a test, you could do this testing for one of those 4 parts, whilst leaving the others dry.
Yeah.
Right. Now, if we go back to your statement on page 70, so you've filled the system, you've done your testing, and then it says before flushing. What's the flushing?
So flushing's essentially flushing water through the system to make sure you're cleaning out any, essentially we'll use the word debris, but anything in the pipework.
Is that before or after the testing?
That would be, they would probably do a wee bit before, but generally be after the test. And they would hydraulically test first to make sure the pipe work's sound. So they didn't need to do any repairs or take pipe work out before that test, that flushing.
And then how do you flush? You literally open all the taps and just so it happens?
Yeah, whatever outlets are there, you would open to draw water through, yeah.
And do you draw every single pipe?
They would draw, they should draw every single pipe, yeah.
So that includes, in a single room, the shower, the loo, the hot and cold water, the two sinks, all four water sources.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that flushing doesn't involve emptying the system.
No, generally, you're as much as you're taking water out, water's going into the system at the same time.
So what's then on your list is commissioning at this point?
So that's the kind of what I would call pre-commission activities, the test and the
Sorry,
flushing.
just so that I'm keeping up. You're describing the flushing process, and essentially that's by opening taps, operating the shower, flushing the WCs. But you reminded Mr. Bankintosh that as that flushing is happening, water is coming into the system, so it remains a wet system at that stage.
Yeah, that would be the process.
Right. Thank you.
And so if we look at the commissioning that you're now describing, because I'm assuming this order is deliberate on your part. This is the order of events.
Yeah.
Right. Good. So in the commissioning process, what are you talking about here? In this after flushing, what are you doing now?
So after flushing, and again, this isn't that process isn't an immediate. It wasn't like day one this happened, day two the next thing happened. There might have been time between that. But commissioning would be setting up the domestic hot water to make sure the right temperatures come out to the turn pipes. It would be doing the TMV commissioning. It would be doing just the temperatures.
And this is the work that you would be organising.
This is the work that Mercury would do. Yeah,
but you're the manager of this process.
I'm the manager of the commissioning. Yeah.
So, is it right to think that a part of the hospital system could have been filled with water before you started your commissioning, but it certainly couldn't have been filled with after you started commissioning? You have to have the water system.
You have to have the water system filled before you commission. Yeah, definitely.
So, what's the disinfection item on this list?
So that's what's been referenced in the sterilisation. That is essentially introducing a chemical to clean the pipework. Before you take your samples, and to make sure you've got a clean system.
And then you do the samples.
Yeah, samples after disinfection, yeah.
And you mentioned doing samples in December 2014 with H&V. Would there be other samples taken?
There would be samples taken at the start of the filling process to make sure the water we're using to fill, or Mercury we're using to fill, was of a good quality, the water.
But would you do any other samples between that initial samples and the end samples that you talked about?
No.
No. And then what's post-disinfection draw? That's to draw out the disinfectant.
You've got that, and then you've also got and I think it was bi-weekly flush to make sure you're not sitting with stagnant water after the disinfection, to make sure the water is still moving and staying clean.
Does that effectively amount to people whose job it is to go around and open taps?
Yeah, that's it.
Now, does the system then remain full of water, albeit there is this flushing process until handover?
Yes.
So we wouldn't want to think that it was then emptied and then refilled later.
The only situation you would get where you'd have to drain down part of the system if there was a leak.
Right.
And you then had to fix the leak. So you would need to drain down, fix the leak, retest and refill it.
And so H&V commissioning, they were the subcontractors responsible for managing the water system?
They were Mercury's water treatment specialists, yeah.
Right. Now, one of the questions we've asked a lot of people, but they don't seem to have either understood our question or answered it, we'll see how we go, is who was the duty holder? Now, I do appreciate there's an exciting question of who was the duty holder after handover, but I'm not interested in that because we've asked enough UGC people that we'll ask more. Yeah. I'm interested who was the duty holder before handover.
It would have been Mercury. The duty holder wasn't necessarily a term that was used, but Mercury were responsible for the system, filling, testing, commissioning the system.
Isn't there a responsibility on a construction site with water that falls to the person who manages the whole site to manage the water system safely?
Well, Mercury were managing the whole water system. They were installing the whole of the water system.
Because the distinction I make is that Are you familiar that in operational buildings you'll have a duty holder, often
Yes.
be a senior officer, and then you might have a responsible person or an authorized person who does the actual work?
Yep.
In this context, it might well be that Mercury are doing the actual work. Who's the actual legal duty holder for the site before handover?
I'm not entirely sure.
Was there one?
I don't recall. Merky would have had a manager. There were people doing the job. Merky would have had a manager who was responsible for that system.
We've discussed in evidence with some witnesses, and I'm going to create a question quite carefully. The suggestion by Greater Glasgow and Clyde that the water system was systemically contaminated at handover. And I appreciate the subject of litigation, so I want to keep it very vague. What sources of evidence exist to provide a viewpoint that that's not true?
It would be the sample analysis of the Mercury and H&V, the samples they took, and the cleanliness of the water from the samples. That would be the only thing that would give you that information, as far as I would know.
There's no other testing that you're aware of in that period?
No.
Right. I want to move on to the topic of open-ended pipes. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to put to you something that I'm putting in more detail to Mr. Pike, but it occurred to me you might be able to answer it. Allow me a moment just to find my note. Could you go to bundle 40, document 175? I'll just find the right page. So what I'm going to take you to is a project steering group meeting, which I recognise you wouldn't have attended. I can find my own note now. So that's page 834. And this is a meeting in 2012. Mr. Ballingall was present, Seaborn, Mr. Bicknell, Mr. McGubbin, Douglas Ross, Mike Sharples, Alison Hurst, and Peter Moyer. And do you see how at the top of page 855, can we go to page 854 first? This is a document I hadn't told my colleague about, so I recognise I'm slightly ambushing here. So that's the minutes I was reading out for. And then we go on to the next page. You see it says wet system pipe testing. AS and DP will discuss further with this meeting. The initial thought was test with air, but now doing water tests. The method of testing will include implications of conditions of the pipe work and commissioning, will require sterilisation of the pipes. AMS noted there'll be no water in the system of pipes on March 2013. The testing will progress area by area, and with completion, heat will be introduced to the areas, albeit at a very low level, and the discussion of a programme being produced. Now, you've talked about 2014. Do you have any awareness of water being in the pipes in March 2013?
Not in March 2013. I do now know from looking at some documents after the witness statement that plant room 21 was probably around June 2013.
Right. So parts of the system might have been filled.
Yep.
And when you say plant room 21, do you just mean the plant room or the whole quarter of the system that's attached to it?
It would start in a plant room and then it progressively work through the areas that was serving.
And so from your knowledge, when would the whole of the plant room 21 quarter of the system have been filled?
Probably, well, again, looking at the information, probably around about June, it would have started June 2013 in the plant room and then worked its way down to the rest of the areas of the building. So it might be over a number of weeks.
Because,
Sorry, my fault entirely. Are we talking about the part of the system that's served by plant room 21, or are we thinking of after that part
Yes.
of the system in the later part of 2013,
Let's go back to
the
bundle
other
21.
the
Lord.
other quarters being filled? Sorry, that's a bad question, but
I think, Lord, I can probably focus it by reference to the drawing.
Yeah,
If we go back to bundle 21, page 213, which was open before, swap that over. And we zoom in. So you're discussing plant room 21, which is one of the two parts of the system service from booster pump 2. You're nodding. So are you saying that in the summer of 2013, plant room 21 itself would have had its water systems filled?
That's what it looks like, yeah.
Yeah. And then over the following weeks, the rest of the parts that are serviced from plant room 21 would have been serviced.
Yes.
Right. Okay, yes. I think I might take the opportunity of showing you some more documents then. Just allow me a moment to make sure I've got the right one, because if we start going through Capita supervisor reports and I get the wrong ones, we'll be here all day. So, yes. If we can go to bundle 33, document 83, page 1807, which is a page 1807. Which is a project supervisor meeting from the 7th September 2012. Again, don't think you're there. But we have an entry about air leakage testing. Is this that earlier stage in the process that you were talking about?
Um,
You might take a moment to just read that.
Yeah. No, I don't think so. I think this is building air leakage testing,
Okay,
as in the
thank you.
fabric of the building.
Let's jump forward to page 1855 in the same bundle, which is now July 2013. So again, it's a meeting at which you're not present. But do you see how there is a reference to air leakage testing
Yep.
on the fourth item? But again, you think it's testing rooms.
That's testing building for RSK. I noticed in there where the person that did the building fabric testing. So that's
Understand.
definitely.
Let's go on to the next page, page 1856. However, it does talk about testing water systems. Do you see how the third paragraph there, DH also noted in relation to the testing of the water systems, the NHS team need to understand the principles that Brookfield will be doing to charge systems. AFO advised that Brookfield will be carrying out air tests in the first instance, then would fill with water and retardant for testing, and the water retardant will be left in the pipework. PM noted that leaving the water in the pipework was preferable to emptying the pipe without testing and leaving empty. So what's this retardant they might be talking about here?
I'm not entirely sure if that was a fire system. I'm not entirely sure. The word retardant isn't something that we would use in water testing as such.
Yes, because the thing that's concerning, my lord. I know it's a bit unfair to ask you about minutes you weren't at, but the reason I ask this question is because you have described a process that starts with hydraulic testing, then involves sort of like air testing, pneumatic testing, hydraulic, then actual flushing, then commissioning, more flushing, then some disinfection.
Yep.
And this, if it's about the main water system, is talking about retardant and leaving it in the system. Have you come across that in any of the records you've looked at?
No, the only thing, again, retardants thrown me as a word used for that, that was more like a fire system. It might have been, you might have introduced sometimes biocide into a water system you're filling it. That might have been the case. I can't
But you
remember.
can't help us about what it actually is.
No.
Right. Just see if I can get anywhere with these documents for a moment. Yeah. So we go on to a meeting on the 8th of August 2013, which is page 1862. And this is definitely about a wet system and water test, item 4. Water being used for this purpose was metered, so NHS would be aware of the amount being used. For tank testing, a large amount of water will be used. To be fully jettisoned, it would be wasteful. There may be issue of contamination. The system remains charged until brought into use. Capita will check. I'm just wondering, is based on any of the work you've done around your statement or as a commissioner, can you help us about whether there's any filling of the tanks in 2013?
There might have been because we used, or Mercury used, the tanks and the booster pumps to take water up to fill heating and chill water systems. So they may have been filled earlier to allow them to fill the heating and chilled systems, not so much the domestic system.
Right. And then they might have reused water.
They didn't reuse water, no. Water would have been, if it was filling the systems, water would have been introduced from the Scottish water main, potentially into the tank, and then piped out to the system. We wouldn't reuse water, no. Can't think of any situation you would.
But what they seem to be suggesting on this page is that water used for tank testing would then be used elsewhere in the system.
Only if basically it was water, when the tanks were built, then potentially, you need to put water in to make sure there's no leaks in the tank, and that water was then used as in pumped from the tank booster to fill the system. It may have been that.
That's helpful. It was a little bit off-piste, but that is helpful. What I suppose I would just wrap up, we took it off the screen, is just to recap here. There seem to be two concepts around here. One is your principal evidence from your own knowledge is that in summer 14, there would have been filling, starting in Plant 21, of a quarter of the system for the tests that you were involved in doing.
I think it was 2013. That was when Platinum 21 was.
But then the rest of the system fills up.
Yeah, would follow.
So you think the Plant 21 starts in 2013, and then your tests are in 2014?
From the evidence I've looked at and some of the information I've looked at, it was 2013, and that stage, the pipework from Platinum 21 down was pressure tested at that stage. The commissioning work would take place later on.
And then the commissioning work you've described ends up with a stage where it gets handed over to H&V, who then manage it to end.
Yes.
Do you have any awareness of management of the water system for the prevention of the growth of things that shouldn't be there, biofilms and such, between these early fills in 13 and the end of the commissioning process?
I know it was part of the process was to happen, but I couldn't stake that everything had been done at that stage. No,
but the only evidence that exists the system wasn't contaminated at handover is those final tests.
It's the samples.
Okay, thank you. Allow me just to check an email I've just received from one of our call participants. Yes, we talked before the coffee break about interactions you had around Ward 4B, and I put to you that asked you whether you had interactions with Professor Williams, and you said you didn't remember. But I think I need to ask you a more general question. So between the start, at any point for the end of 2015, did you have any interactions with Professor Williams about water or ventilation or anything that you can remember?
I don't recall.
And simply for completeness, did you have any interactions with any other member of the team? So that would have been the senior nurse, Sandra McNamee Devine. Did you have interactions with her?
The name rings a bell, but I couldn't tell you if I had interaction or not. I certainly dealt with, there was nursing staff from the Beatson. that came to Ward 4B when we were doing the client training as such on it. So if that was one of the nurses involved in that.
Okay. And then you'd already discussed your involvement with Peters and Dr. Inkster, so I won't go over that again. Right. And I think it probably is quite important. You've explained in terms of your learning about the air change rate in the system as arriving from checking the M&E log in response to Dr. Peters' questions in June 2015. That's correct?
I think so.
Yeah, right. I think it's really actually going to be quite significant. I need to press you on this. Are we right to think that she asks you some questions, you go away and do your investigations, and you find out what's in the M&E log? Is that the order?
I can't remember whether it was she asked me directly or that came via the project team, but that was how then I started to go and start doing a bit of research and what exactly was the situation.
Once you found the M&E clarification log and you knew what you then knew, did you have any meetings with Dr. Peters after that date?
I don't recall.
Who might you have told in the GGC team or world about the M&E log at that point?
I would imagine, again, I don't recall exactly, but probably Peter Moyer, Ian Powery, and potentially David Loudon. That was the kind of three people that were discussing these items with.
Why would you have told them?
Because I was asked the information, so I would have got them the information and told them this is where the lower air change rate comes from in these rooms.
Shouldn't they have known that?
David Loudon came to the project later on, so whether he knew that or not, I don't know. Again, Peter Moyer, he'd been involved in the project for a while. I would have thought maybe he should know that.
Okay. Well, Lord, I've got no particular questions at this point, but it may be that some of my colleagues have some questions. I wonder we might take a short break for me to find out.
We'll do that. Mr. Wilson, what I need to know is, and what Mr. McIntosh needs to know is whether there are any other questions in the room. So I'll ask that you return to the witness room. Shouldn't be much more than about 10 minutes.
Okay, no problem.
Well, Lord, I have two questions from my colleagues in the room.
Mr. Wilson, I understand we have two questions.
Okay.
So the first thing is, just to be clear, we're talking about what water systems we're talking about. Let's put bundle 21, page 213 back on the screen and just recap. And I think you said two things about filling the water system, and please correct me if I've misremembered it. One is that your work of commissioning that starts with pneumatic testing started in the summer of 2014.
No,
No.
that would have been the first plant in 21 would have been 2013.
So when did the commissioning actually take place?
The commissioning was filling and testing would have been 2013 for plant room 21, and the commissioning would have been after that, probably when the heat was generated from the energy centre to heat the calorifiers. I can't quite recall when that is.
That'd be sometime in 14 then?
Yeah.
Right. So when you say plant room 21, are you talking about, on this diagram, the plant room fed from booster pump 2 that is approximately a quarter of the system, that then fills the rest of the system downstream from the plant room over a period of time after?
Yeah, if that's how it worked. Yeah, that's my recollection. Of it.
And this is all within domestic water system?
That is domestic water system, yeah.
And you're not telling me anything about other systems like chilled water or hot or heat transfer systems? This is just domestic.
They would have been filled probably at a similar time, but that domestic I was talking about, yeah.
And so, just to be clear, the plant room starts being filled in June 13. It then will feed down to the rest of the system that's fed from it. And then later, the following year, you actually do the commissioning work.
Yeah.
And then the other plant rooms will come online sequentially in order to all be finished by the end of the year.
Yep.
Thank you.
And when you say the end of the year, that's 2014.
14. And then H&V will do their final tests. And that's the evidence that the system wasn't contaminated.
Yeah.
Thank you. We take it off the screen. The other question relates to your work done in the autumn of 2015, in RORD 4B. And I asked you a few questions about who instructed it and what you were trying to do, but I didn't ask this question, which is, at the end of that exercise, what air change rate was being achieved in the 24 rooms in Ward 4B?
6 air changes.
Why wasn't 10 air changes being achieved?
Because the plant that was there and the ductwork size in there couldn't take the capacity to increase the airflow rate to give you 10 air changes.
Does that have any connection with the scale of the system linked back to the 40 litres a second in the M&E clarification log?
No. The Ward 4B system, the changes that were made in 2013 increased, as my understanding, increased the air change rate to 6 air changes at that time, which was 80 litres a
So
second.
that's a different system.
No, that's the Ward 4B system.
Yeah, the ward system is different from the other general wards.
Yes, different air handling rates, yes.
We'll just take this from you. In a general ward, at handover, they can do 40 litres a second.
Yes.
Ward 4B, because of the changes in 2013, can do twice that.
Yes.
Which is 6 air changes.
Yes.
But it can't do 10.
No.
Was any request made to you in 2015 to get to 10?
Yeah, that was the initial word we were getting back from the Beatson people. They wanted what they had in the Beatson, which was 10 air changes, and which is what reflected in the SHTM for neutropenic patients, which was talked about then.
And did you tell them you couldn't do it?
Yes.
Who did you tell?
That would go via the project team, Peter Moyer, Ian Powry.
Thank you. Lord, I don't think I have any further questions. Thank you, Ms. Walsh.
Is the inability of a system to achieve 10 air a function of the specification of the air handling unit or the ductwork or both?
Probably both.
Both. This is maybe too general a question, but was there any knock-on, as it were, from the decision that the single rooms in the general wards, which I think we're talking about hundreds of rooms in the hospital, would have an air change rate of 2.5. I don't know if I've maybe framed that question precisely enough, but does the fact that GDC agreed that the rooms in general wards would have an air change rate of 2.5, presumably that then determines the specification of the air handling units and the ductwork which serve these rooms. Does that have any knock-on effect for the other rooms in the hospital? In other words, rooms where specialized ventilation may be appropriate?
No, because there was various air handling units serving various areas
Right.
of the building, so they would be separate. And obviously some of the more specialist ventilation like theatres and isolation rooms, they're separate systems, complete separate systems.
And that applies to ductwork,
Yes.
and air handling unit.
Yeah, air handling unit would, be in a plant room, and it was ductwork that would go down to that ward or wards with, out to grills in the ceiling.
Thank you.
Well, I did have a follow-up question, which might be of assistance. Thinking about the difference between the Ward 4B ventilation system installed that you commissioned and the ones for each of the other wards, the general wards, are they the same sort of air handling units?
Same manufacturer, yeah.
Just bigger ones?
Just bigger ones. There might have been in Ward 4B, as there was in theatres and isolation rooms, you may have had twin motors. So if one motor was broken, another motor would power the fan. So there may have been.
They're just a bigger version of the same thing.
Yeah, pretty much.
And the ductwork, is it the same ductwork or bigger ductwork?
It would be bigger ductwork for bigger airflow and air change rates.
And this may be outside your area of expertise, but I think I'll ask anyway. Those larger air handling units of 4B, would there have been any room in those plant rooms to fit even bigger ones in?
When we looked the 4B upgrades, we looked with the consultant Tough Sud Wallace Whittle to look at see if we could put bigger units in, and it was very difficult in that particular plant room.
Is that because of the size of the plant room?
The size of the plant room and where the plant physical places, because as much as you need the size of the plant to fit the air handling unit, you need the size of the plant room to be able to maintain that, withdraw coils. So you had to be very careful how you position plant within the plant room.
So the size of the plant room is probably the constraint that prevented 10 air changes?
That was one of the constraints. Again, ductwork size within a ceiling void might have been another.
So you have to have the height of ceiling void?
You need to have it to get your depth or width of duct as well.
And stop me if I've gone beyond your level of expertise, but does that mean that the inability to achieve 10 air changes in that retrofit in 2015 was to some extent driven by decisions made about the size of duct rooms and ceiling voids back in 2010, 11, or even earlier?
It would have had an impact, yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lord.
Thank you, Mr. McIntosh. Mr. Wilson, that is the end of your evidence, and you're therefore free to go. But before you go, can I say thank you for the work in responding to the questionnaire. And as you've explained, you've clearly done some reading to put you in a position to answer these questions. Thank you for that, and thank you for your attendance today. But you're now free to go. Thank you.
Good.
Now, Darren Pike this afternoon.
At 1 o'clock, yes, Lord.
Right.
2 o'clock, rather, sorry.
2 o'clock. Well, we'll sit again at 2.
Thank you.